So today's movie is The Purple Rose of Cairo. And I think that it was encapsulated for me in many ways in the very first line. If we go to the movies tonight, we could forget about all that junk. Right? When in your life have you tried to escape that junk, and how did you do it? Kind of is the question that it asks, right? Because no matter what the junk is that you're married to, I mean that you're living, no, that you're, wait a second. whatever the junk is in your life, there's always something else that will call your heart and say, maybe that's the escape. And the question is it really or not? Where did you see God in this movie? How is it that God appeared?
Brian.
Earl and Sandy, welcome.
Thank you. You finally made it.
We have Scott and Diane and John, Catherine, Nancy, Doris, and Sharon are here with you. So how about the rest of you? Where did the divine appear somewhere in this movie? Because there were plenty of places where it didn't quite appear. For example, a husband. Yeah, her husband was not God embodied. Although, did you notice how he tried to be? I mean, not that he tried to be a good God. He tried to be the God of her world, which is what we often do as human beings, don't we?
Jim, I'm late, so I don't know what happened, but I have a comment.
Come Ed.
I'm thinking about a Greek tragedy when I saw that.
Yes.
Human is in trouble. God comes down, not necessarily to help, but just for his own good. And nothing really good comes of it. And then it just goes back as it was. But it just seems so much of like a Greek tragedy to me.
Yeah, nice analogy there, because Tom Baxter, the explorer, the character in the movie, absolutely had otherworldly type of qualities, didn't he?
Yes.
And seemed to truly love her, but didn't really know what that meant either.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And then the other embodiment of that person, Gil, the actor, loved her in a whole different other way in order to use her to get his alter ego back.
And I think he felt a little bad about it on the airplane, but not that bad to help her.
Not bad enough to get on the next plane back.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So despite the negative things about the husband, Monk perhaps was the only one in the movie to voice reality when he says near the end, it's not the movies, this is real life, you will be back.
Yeah. Which is the scary thing, isn't it? Is that sometimes, as much as we try to escape from our stuff, whatever the stuff is, we have to be there. How many would love to escape from a debate last night?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Right? It was just a scary moment of where we're at, and it would be great to run away from it all, but we can't just do that, can we?
Jim, I thought it gave a really good look at the lack of options that were available to people during that period of time too. And Cecilia's going to the movie over and over again till she really almost knows the same lines that are going to be spoken. She enters that world. And Tom's coming out into her world is almost a reversal of what she does in terms of entering the world of those movies.
And Cecilia,
an option for her at this point.
Yeah.
And the kinds of movies that were made were ones that diverted people from the reality of what their lives were like.
Yeah, I don't know how people lived through the 1930s. But we better figure that out, because I have a feeling that there might be another set of things like that as we move forward. I mean, the economic ramifications of this year might be long and difficult for a lot of people. And at least part of what we have to do is figure out how to be there for the Cecilias. Because she was that way for several different reasons. First of all, her husband was, while he was as realistic as what Scott said, he was also not very motivated to change it. Not very, you know, he was stuck in that world more than what she was. And, well, I shouldn't say that. He was stuck economically in that world more than what she was. But she was also stuck because she, as a woman, she had less power to be able to change that world in many ways. Right? And so it was at least partially delving with how is it that is done with the gender issues. What does a Cecilia do here? And he knows, you're going to have to come back to me. Which is scary, isn't it? And that's what we've left a lot of people to. And will that be true in this economic time? Our niece was just left by her husband with 2 kids. She'd gone most of the way through college, but then stopped when she got married. And so is at that space where often people find themselves in divorce. I have no education, no job, no, you know, and they'd made the decision to let her stay home. How does she escape from that space? The space that you could say she made, but she also made because her husband, like the husband in this story, kind of put her in a certain role only.
And they all had escapes. Monk too had his escape in his gambling that he was doing.
Yeah, that was his way of being able to be something different, huh? Not have to stay there.
I'm wondering about the 1930s and thinking about it in a different kind of way now, because it's an interesting movie on many levels, but I wonder if that's where the rise of, you know, just escape into fantasy really took root, and also the ascendancy of adulation and wanting to emulate the movies, if that isn't where we started with all of this starstruckness. And if you look back at that time to the roots of all of these people that have gotten publicity and made piles of money for doing really nothing. Yeah. And I think about sports, I think about movie stars, people who are, you know, overpaid way out of proportion to their shelf life or their real talents or abilities. And it's really a condemnation of that world.
Mm-hmm. But the challenge of it is, Catherine, is they don't do nothing. No matter how much we try to say that, compared to a doctor, maybe yes, but that escape into that let me set it aside, all this truth, let me set it aside for a time, is not a non-contribution to us, right?
Well, I think that the problem, that arises is people take it as fact or as real.
Right.
I don't think that people always see or have always seen. I think that it has seemed so real to people that they have attached an importance to it. I don't mind escapism as long as you remain in touch with reality.
Yeah.
And recognize that this is just this is just a story. It's not how real life really does work. But there is a desire on the part of producers and directors to create this world.
Yeah.
And you see it over and over again.
That's right. Because at least part of what movies allow us to do is see somebody who's more beautiful than the person we're stuck with, more adventurous, more romantic, more whatever, right? And I don't mean that just in our spouses, but in all the people around us. And so that in some ways they get to dream the ideal for us. But you're right, is if then we come back and we say, honey, why aren't you like that? Then oftentimes that becomes the dysfunctional, isn't it? But when you're stuck in a dead end space like Cecilia was, it's hard not to say, I need something over there. She needed to leave her husband, right? But could she? What were the avenues for her to be able to?
Seemed so, not accepting, but kind of accepting of his behavior toward her. And it seemed to me like as she watched these movies, she got a vision for a different way of people relating. And when I watched this movie, I was telling Greg afterwards, it reminded me as a child, my home was, complicated, and I was really affected by TV shows that I saw where husbands treated wives kindly, and it just gave me like a vision of this different world that was out there.
Yeah.
And I really count that as one of the graces in my life, that I was kind of given this vision of a different way that families could function, that was positive. And I get that you can't take a made up story and expect life to be like that. But I do think that part of this story was that this kind of called her out of her, where her space, where she was at. And,
Right.
And that can be a positive thing. I think really good art can definitely do that for people. I mean, I think seeing the beauty of any kind of, some writing or art often, calls you toward something beautiful and wonderful that is obviously a concept that some person has come up with about how they would like the world to be. So anyway, that was just kind of my experience. I could relate to it on that level.
Yeah. And I think that's at least part of what any good art, like you say, is trying to do. It's trying to draw us beyond ourselves. I think it was really important for us to realize that Gil, the actor, showed up next to Tom Baxter, the character, so that she could see that the two didn't match, right? As any good artist doesn't necessarily need to, as a person, rise to the majesty of whatever that art piece is saying, right? Because the person may have the flawedness of themselves, but it doesn't take away the amazing above flawed that someone can make in an art piece.
Darren and I were talking about kind of the movie portraying the world of thought versus the physical world we live in. And at first, as we talked, I referred to fantasy, which sometimes has a negative connotation. And for me, it had a negative connotation. And that we need to live in the real world, not in our imaginary world. But Sharon then shared what she's already shared a minute ago about how looking at an imaginary world can show possibilities to us. And then I realized, well, the whole notion of ideals do lead us to a higher place, even though they are imaginary, they are thought, not reality. we want to make them realities sometimes. But so it's a complex interrelation, this notion of the imaginary, the ideal, the fantasy, and the physical world we actually live in.
Yeah, absolutely. And can I say, Greg, it's not just, it's a lot of different levels. It's also, I've seen people who have played out this Cecilia part in their religious world, that they have this dream lover in Jesus or some other God that makes it so that they stop acting realistically in the world in which they live.
Mhm.
Right? I think at least part of our political issues right now is because someone's people have made a God out of somebody.
Yeah.
Right? That is not an appropriate way to place that person in the role. Right? But yet there's good things about it. The Tom Baxter had the lack of flaws that happen in human beings, right? She got to dream the better than in him. Isn't that what we like to do, though? Whether it's true or not, right? He may leave me, but Jesus never will.
Well, I think too, some of it is taking responsibility for ourselves, and that neither Gil nor Tom could save her, and how neither Trump nor Biden will save us. But we want someone.
I think you're exactly right, Nancy. The struggle right now is trying to figure out how to allow the election to not, in our mind, to not have solved the problem. Because whatever happens in the election, there's a lot of work that's going to have to be done. That which is causing much of the discord in our nation isn't going to be solved by whoever gets elected. In fact, it may be augmented. In the time between election and inauguration, I really worry about.
Well, I worry about the environment because there will be nothing done positively if Trump is elected again.
That's right.
With Biden, I think he has a plan, and he sees what's happening to the nation, to the world, because of global warming.
That's right. And I think there's lots of those kinds of things. It doesn't mean that my friend Dean, that I talk to you about all the time, is going to act appropriately because Biden has a better environmental plan or a better plan in every way, right? He, at least first, he's likely to say, I got to rise up in arms against this that has happened. And I mean that literally. And what do we do in that moment? How do we sit with our friends and neighbors that are disappointed if the election goes the way that I wish it will? And part of that, going back to our original question, is because of where you see God. All right. If Dean is placing God in a certain political thing, in certain ideas that have to be true, certain visions of the United States in this way, not that way, then this election could be you attacking my God, you destroying my vision of the kingdom that God is building, right?
Oh, I think they have a very limited vision of what God is. That is making God down to their size.
Yeah, yeah. But the question is, why do they have that? Are they like Cecilia, who this God from the movie screen that she set up, this Tom Baxter, this new love is definitely a step up from Monk. Because that what she has to live with is, she's well aware why that's wrong.
But I would also say that she, in the process of saying to Tom that he needs to go back on the screen and she's going to choose Gil because he's a real life person, believing that Gil will honor his word to her.
Yeah.
In that space of time there, she knows what's real and what's fantasy.
Yeah.
That Tom belongs back on the screen, and her offer of life with Gil is a promise of reality.
Yeah.
I think that that's where the real tragedy is. Then when Gil leaves, she doesn't have anything except to go back to the next movie.
Yeah.
And then she will have to go back to her husband.
Yeah.
But she's got a glimpse of that reality
Yeah.
of connecting with what's real rather than connecting with what's unreal. And then that's
Yeah. And that's the thing, isn't it? Gil is also fantasy, but she knows it's closer to reality. So as he leaves on his airplane and she goes back to her home, my question is always, okay, so what next? What happens in that space? Because now she's realized fantasy doesn't solve it, either one of the fantasies, but how does she move to a better reality than this reality she has?
I thought it was interesting that the last scene, it wasn't her walking back into their apartment. It was her going back to a movie.
To the movie.
Yeah.
Right.
Which may be what she chooses always. Okay, I can at least escape from the reality of this over here. I just have to keep it in perspective, and
Or again, I think her dissatisfaction with how she was treated in her home had grown through this. She had experienced men who treated her well. And so she carried that, however that would play out. I mean, one of the most heartbreaking scenes in the movie was when, she leaves him, and that scene of her coming back into that dark apartment.
That's hard, isn't it?
Really, it was just like, oh, so heartbreaking. And I loved that Woody Allen chose to not have her do that at the end. I think that was sort of hopeful.
Yeah, at least a possibility that something different would have emerged out of this. But how many have known at least one person in your life that wasn't able to walk away from a relationship that seemed very clear to you that that's not a relationship they should stay in?
Oh yeah.
What do we do in the midst of that is a huge thing. How are we in that other person's life?
Mm.
And it's hard because obviously we can't make choices for them. They get to decide. But at the same time, we can sure have opinions about. And those opinions can show up in functional or dysfunctional ways, can't they? Supportive ways or ways that don't quite support.
What's interesting about that is people like that often have the reverse of what we're discussing, which is we've been discussing fantasy, which is an imaginary positive versus reality, the physical world.
Mm-hmm.
But some people have an imaginary view of themselves as weak, ugly, incapable, that others of us look at and say, that's not how you are. But
Yeah.
for some reason, that self-image is like a weight that holds them down.
Yep. And how do we help them to escape from that piece of poverty, right? Emotional and spiritual poverty of only seeing themselves this large.
Or
And
even, go ahead.
in the beginning of the movie, I saw Mia Farrow's character as the stronger character because she was the breadwinner.
Yeah.
And then the irony is that she loses her job because she is, her head is in the clouds and she keeps spending time chatting rather than doing her job. And she's so distracted with her fantasy world that she keeps dropping orders, plates on the floor. But she has the capability of taking care of herself. And Sharon pointed out, not only just now, but when we watched the movie, that she seemed to get more confidence and to be more assertive with her husband as the movie went along. So in one way, she lost her strength. In another way, she kind of gained new strength.
Yeah. Where
that would go when the movie closed, who knows?
You know, the hard part for me, Greg, is always that it's hard for me not to see Mia Farrow any longer as a full-grown, mature woman because I've watched her in all these movies, right? And so she's not a little girl anymore. And yet in very many ways in this movie, that's what role she's supposed to be in, is as a under mature person trying to figure out this beginning of life. And so it was really kind of strange for me to figure that out because you're smart enough, you're old enough, you're mature enough, you've done enough. And yet in this movie, she hasn't. And what does she grow into? Nancy, you were going to say something.
Very much like what Greg said. And when you asked earlier, what do we do as friends or relatives to help but not fix someone? And even in her being encouraging to Gil and Tom and like being the cheerleader for them, and you're talking, Jim, talking about your niece, what can we do to be the cheerleader for someone that is in the process of, or we all are in the process, but what can we do?
What can we do is always a thing. You know, I love our motto, choose love, but how it plays out in situations like this is the real challenge. How do we help Cecilia in the best way possible, not in one that disempowers her yet again? What do we do to step in and do the right things in a situation like that? Right? Because she doesn't need one more patronizing person in her life.
This is where the whole political divide becomes relevant to me because liberal side wants to care for people. The conservative side says if we care too much for people, we stunt their growth and their self-sufficiency. And so there's this balancing act. In our political world, it's one or the other, but in reality, it's a balancing act.
But Greg, I don't think it's as much one or the other in the political world either. I mean, Woody Allen was very purposeful in placing several spaces in there where someone called out something like, that could be the work of Reds or anarchists, right? Because the lines between are not as simple, and yet we make them very simple in order to say, all those people over there on that side, that's all wrong. And it's just never that simple, right? There's not a singular answer that solves the political stuff in and around us, right? And yet we want to. How many would love to have a perfect candidate that suddenly will go back to Camelot and everything will work out perfectly? It just doesn't work quite that way, does it?
Obama was close.
Yeah. Well, the thing of it is if we remember, Camelot wasn't perfect either.
Well, and also with Obama, I think we were looking for a savior and thought we had found one.
Yeah.
You know,
but
that wasn't fair.
Well, but here it is. For us, he might have been close to Camelot. For your Republican friends, that was a road downhill. Part of the reason why Trump was elected is because of the story that they heard in those 8 years that felt good for me, but were the opposite for them. For whatever reason. I don't think it's because Obama was wrong. I think it's because they misinterpreted the moment, but it doesn't matter, does it? Because what came out of that was out of whatever they thought was the reality. So what are they going to tell, and what are we going to tell out of this reality as we go into the next 4 years?
I think this is such hard work right now. I mean, it makes me think of the, wide is the path that leads to narrow. It's like this narrow path.
Narrow path.
Through how we, how we balance, how we interact with people who are feeling so intensely different. I know I've been really struggling, the Supreme Court nominee, I hear about her having adopted children and having a special needs child. And, you get this sense of this person who's got these traits that are admirable. And yet, her legal history, very worrisome. Her religious positions, very worrisome. It's so complex, and it is so hard to hold this tension right now. I've been telling Greg, it's like, I feel like the word for me during this time is fortitude. It's like just trying to have the fortitude to keep going along and it's just hard work.
Yeah. The hard part, Sharon, is that just like you can have an imaginary boyfriend on the screen, you can also have an imaginary enemy. And I think that that's part of what's happened in our politics is abortion, specifically the issue, has become the panacea enemy, the windmill, if you will, that if I just solve this. So I had a friend of mine the other day who said, as tragic as it will be, maybe the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade will at least take that out of their weapon box. And so now we're going to have to look at other issues because they can't say abortion to be that which blinds them.
I think we are getting distracted all too often by in our imaginations. And I remember when people were all up in arms because of John Kennedy and because he was a Catholic. Mm-hmm. And what a big
Hello?
Tilting at windmills and being Quixote-like, and we've got to get grounded. And I'm so sick of most everything. I'm sick of, excuse me, but I'm sick of Martha McSally, and I'm even getting a little tired of Mark Kelly. I can't abide these ads. I did not watch the debates because I kind of figured it would be Donald Trump being Donald Trump, and sure enough, that's exactly what he was. And nothing was achieved that I can tell from watching snippets of him last night. I refuse to watch the debates because it's not going to fix anything, my watching, except to raise my blood pressure. So I think we've got to get real about what the real issues are and not being so distracted by all these side stories and side issues. And, I think everybody is presumed to like everybody's going to have so darn much power, even as an individual senator or whatever you are. And as far as Amy Coney Barrett goes, well, she's going to be a lot like Scalia because that's her hero and mentor from years ago. And I guess we'll just muck along, and maybe it will work in an advantage kind of way as to how she sees things. And it may be in some kind of convoluted way a blessing, even though it doesn't look like one on the surface right now.
Well, Catherine, here's my basic view of life, the universe, and everything. Right? Although we can't deny that the downturns happen. The question for me always is if God is present, things are as a whole on an upward movement. Okay, we may be going down like this occasionally, but we're getting higher and higher as we move. And so I think what you said just a little bit ago is exactly what we have to say. Whatever happens in this moment, how do we move in it in a way that allows the highest ideals, the closest to the divine vision as we can get in this moment. And we can't do that perfectly in any moment. But what do we do to be able to maximize as much as possible? Right? It could be win the next election, but it could be heal the wounds that caused this election. Right? And both of those are not bad movements. It's just what are you going to do? What gets in the way of that is our fantasy. Okay, the Tom Baxter, look how perfect he is. I'm just going to let him love me. That's much simpler than dealing with either of the two realities, the movie star who's going to leave me or the husband who's going to misuse me. It's simpler, isn't it?
What I thought was kind of interesting about the actor Tom Baxter stepping off the screen is he was so scripted. You know, he knew how to function. He knew his lines and he knew the script in the story, but he had no basis to function in the world because he didn't know about it. He was
Yes, you're right.
and not really three-dimensional because he was an imaginary person.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just have to say that when I think about this movie, what you're just saying, Catherine, like just the story is so hokey and absurd. And the fact that Woody Allen pulled this off so beautifully, I mean, it's just the genius of Woody Allen, who, I mean, there's a topic about complexity. This guy who's able to create this beautiful art, and yet we know, you know, his scandal, and Greg and I were talking about that, and kind of have forgotten what all that was about. But anyway, I just thought that the way this movie was put together, the lines and how these characters functioned and how she reacted to everything. I mean, it was just really amazing.
A couple of weeks ago, I sat with the Celebration team and we talked about David Haas. David Haas has written several of our most sung songs, right? There's several of his songs we love. And he is facing charges of sexual misconduct charges, right? And they're just charges, so I don't want to say he's guilty or not guilty, but we had to decide, do we choose to, in this moment, not sing the songs of his that we have been singing for a time as he goes through that in order to honor those who have been charged? It's not a simple type of choice, is it?
No.
We, for a while, didn't go to Woody. We love Woody Allen. I mean, Crimes and Misdemeanors, oh my gosh, my all-time favorite movies. But we chose to boycott him during that time. And now it's like I said, I can't exactly remember what the outcome was, but eventually we sort of drifted back to seeing his art. So
yeah, and the hard part is that if you go to any artist, you're going to find flaws like that, and for that matter, any human being, right? That is trying to do this thing we call life, which is one big art project in a lot of ways. And do we just reject each other because of those flaws? Take a step back for a while, or do we continue to be present for each other? And that's a hard question because flawed individuals can sometimes damage other individuals too. That was definitely true of husband, right, Monk? He was a damaging individual. I don't want her to stay with him. I don't get to quite choose though, do I? I definitely don't. Go ahead, Diane.
I also thought this movie was quintessential Woody Allen because it must really reflect how he feels about movies. That it can take him into a world of fantasy that he loves, and then to create movies in that fantasy world, also having it informed by the history of his life, is just a wonderful thing for him. And I could feel that love of being in that fantasy world
Yeah.
from Woody Allen.
Yeah. I mean, that's the interesting about this is he's critiquing his own medium
Yeah.
in some ways, both in the positive and in the negative,
Mhm.
which is always hard for us to do, is to take both sides of an issue like that. Because at least some of the negative has to fall back on you, right? And we're really good at not letting stuff fall back on us if we're not careful.
I'm thinking about the challenge that we have as human beings, which is to find that middle ground and to speak out, to try to teach our kids things and to be faithful to our friends and not abandon people because they make mistakes or because they make mistakes or they're trying things out. Yet we have to speak our own truth lovingly. What I've always found challenging is to be able to say, I love you as a human being, but I cannot abide your behavior or your actions. And I think we lose sight of that sometimes because it gets all mixed up in people's minds and they feel rejection because they're not really hearing the words.
Yeah.
That labeling people that we've talked about, you know, where you dehumanize them by making them one thing. One of the most stunning sermons I ever heard was when we went to a little Methodist church when we were up in Seattle area, and the pastor was talking about, you know, who Jesus hung out with, and he said it's like he'd be at Starbucks with the child molester, and that, you know, he went on to list this, and you could just feel like this gasp in the audience listening to this because that was so hard to hear. But I think the model of Jesus was he didn't dehumanize anyone.
Right.
I mean, certainly didn't condone, you know, he confronted behaviors that were unacceptable, and didn't condone any victimization, but it seems like in all of the stories he never dehumanized people, you know.
I have a favorite book that's called Messy Spirituality by a guy named Michael Yaconelli. And what it's about is how we try to have nice, clean, perfect spirituality and religion, and because it's simpler and easier and, well, less messy. The story of Jesus is unmessy, right? I mean, excuse me, is unlike that it is messy, that you choose to go in there and get contaminated by the others around you. And that's really hard, isn't it? I find it much simpler to not deal with my Republican friends. No, I shouldn't say that. I like my Republican friends. I don't like these really wackos that call themselves Republicans. It's much simpler not to deal with. But then I think that way about some of my other friends as well. But maybe those are the friends that I need to be with the most.
I had one of these, what I think of as like Holy Spirit moments just in the last week where we were out walking our dog and we went by this house in our HOA with a McSally sign. not a lot of people have signs up. So somebody who does that is pretty vehement. And I know this woman, and she's a guns right person. She's actually was a female target shooting champion or something, you know, so she comes at it, but she's very outspoken. And there were a bunch of cars outside of her house, and we walked by, and just as I was trying to get Maisie, our puppy, to go along the sidewalk, and this car pulled in and somebody got out and the dog was distracted. We walked further and I said, Maisie was distracted by the right-wing wackos. In my mind, I was thinking, you know, they're there talking about how to get Trump elected or whatever. So then about a week later, get this thing from our HOA president saying that this woman, her husband, had passed away, that he'd been in hospice at home, and went on to list all of his kids, his grandkids, a little bit about his life, which again, some really good things, you know. And I was just like so chastened. I thought, I'm sure that gathering that I interpreted and made that snarky remark about was this family gathering to say goodbye to this man. I was just, you know, I mean, I'm grateful for those moments when I just feel ashamed, because it's like, you know, like I always say, words like that are just violence against people, and I don't want to be that person, but they sure slip out of me, you know, so.
Yeah. But choosing the reality rather than the fantasy, whether we place that facade on top of them or they place it on themselves, that's a challenging thing all the time, isn't it?
I've heard someone say that if people get in a room together, which we can't do in the pandemic, but if people get in a room together, extreme differences often can get resolved, usually get resolved if people are in serious dialogue. It's when we live in our silos that the extremism persists. And I don't get around people that are so different from me. All of my social circles are people like me. So I don't know how to turn that around.
Well, go ahead.
Well, I thought that's what Biden was saying about Portland. Why can't we go in there and make sense with each other and hear each other, and not go in with guns, but with words, with thoughts, and with acceptance? I thought that was one of his best points last night.
Yeah, I think one of the most tragic things about President Trump's handling of the racial issues is he only sees it as, I've got to send in the National Guard. Only the enemy there. And one of the most important things we do for each other, with each other, is talk. And that's a challenging thing to do, because it means setting down our weapons, both the ones that we hold in our arms, but also the ones we have in our head and come out of our mouths. And that's a challenging thing to do.
Has St. Francis ever tried to do some sort of organized dialogue kind of thing? I remember seeing some documentary on a group, I can't remember what the issue was. But they met together over like 6 weeks. And at the end, everyone reported, you know, that they started to see each other more realistically as human beings, like we've been talking about.
We actually talked about that during that discussion I told you about at Celebration Team. How do we, in this moment, choose to step towards and have those kinds of conversations? St. Francis has done that type of thing before, but most of our work has been providing a soft space to land for those who have been hurt by. And so in too many ways, they've become the Antichrist, right? They're the ones who caused the damage, and so we're going to be here in love to help those that have been hurt by. But the reality is that no matter how many people we save from, unless we can love them, it doesn't fix the world. And so instead of being this enclave over here, I think the challenge might be, how do we move the enclave of safety and include them in it? And that's a challenging thing, because they got opinions about that. Who's safe and who's not. And in a very real way, we're not.
In my own family, I've chosen, because I want to remain in dialogue with my sister, who is 87, to find points that I can agree with her on, that we can agree on, and to not speak too much about things that are different. And because it's important to me, because she is my only sister and she's a link to my past, that I hold that dear and precious. And so I just choose not to go certain places with her so that I can continue to love her as she is.
I think that's the ongoing issue, is how do I find with each person why I can stay connected to them? Because I'm going to find reasons why not to. But every time I find reasons why not to, how much am I like Gil, the actor, who got what he wanted and then left?
And we don't grow from that, you know?
No.
We can't possibly grow into anything better or different or more if we choose to always opt out.
Yeah. And the hard part is right now, one of the biggest challenges for me, talking to my more conservative friends, is that they are very defensive about talking right now. It's a struggle to be in real conversation with them of any sort.
Mm-hmm.
It feels in some ways a lot like that debate last night, where there was a whole lot of talking, but not much conversing. Right? How do we get back into the conversations about that? I think part of it is us moving away from fantasy and into real relationship, right? The same type of thing that Cecilia had to deal with. And there's not a simple answer to that. As Monk is waiting there saying, I'm going to hit you if you step out of line. And do you really want to go back to that reality? But how do you find the courage to move to the next better reality?
I just really appreciate this place and St. Francis and all of you as we let each other into our lives and as we experience one another. I find this one of the best parts of my week besides Sunday morning. And it's because everybody shows up respectfully and in a real sense and thoughtfully. And I appreciate each one of you so very much and your leadership, Jim. Everybody feels pretty darn real to me, and I thank you for that.
So our next movie is going to continue this conversation. So the good news is you don't have to finish it today. You don't have to solve it all. Our next movie is called Blindness. It's based on a movie by, a book by Jose Saramago. And it's an interesting book to read. If you haven't read it, you should do it. Although it's hard, not just because of the book itself, but because of the way he writes it. He writes it without punctuation and in paragraphs that go on for pages, literally. And so Blindness is the movie. I don't know if I can hold that much closer. If you don't have a copy, you should watch it. It is a violent movie. It's a tough movie to watch in some ways, but it's essentially what do we do in the midst of our own blindness is essentially the question that happens there. All right, let me remind you about one more thing. No, it may not even be a reminder because you may not know this yet. We just sent out a thing yesterday. If you, all of you should know about bringing your puppy dogs and kitty cats and turtles and whatever other animals on Sunday afternoon at 1 o'clock. I recruited some other cute little creatures to be there. Our kids will be on the other side of the car from me, collecting money from you. Okay, so we're gonna fill up our Katie cans. Here's my Katie can thing.
Oh my goodness.
I don't have much room left, so I got to get rid of all this and get it into something. So as you come up and bring your animals for a blessing, also bring all your coins and give them to our children.
A great idea.
To accept that. All right.
Good deal.
We
Thank
could
you
get
for
our
your
puppy
time
to
today.
behave better in the car. We would join you all, but she kind of goes berserk when she gets in the car. So.
Yeah, animals are always less than predictable, just like people. All right, my friends, take care. Thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good week.
You too.